Well, hello, everyone. It's an absolute privilege for me to be hosting this fireside chat with the Honorable Bernard Chan. As you will see, he is one of the most accomplished individuals you will ever meet, and he has a unique perspective. Bernard, welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for your kind introduction.
Hey, Bernard, let's start at the very beginning. You were born into a Thai Chinese family in Hong Kong in 1965, but it wasn't just any Thai Chinese family. Your grandfather, Chin Sopopanit, founded Bangkok Bank and Bangkok Insurance, and your father, Robin, is the founder of Asia Financial Group. So what was it like growing up in a family of super entrepreneurs?
Well, obviously, I am very privileged to associate myself with both my grandfather and my father, especially my grandfather. And of course, he's not the only person, right? I think in his generations, everyone, I think I'm referring to the overseas Chinese, right? To every overseas Chinese that you see, the success story that you now find in Thailand, Malaysia, in Indonesia, Philippines, all the same. They all went there with absolutely nothing. I mean, they were poor, and the reason why they left the country, the China, like my grandfather, was trying to make a living. Now, my grandfather only had I was told he has only had a primary school education, so he didn't start off being a banker. I think when he went to Thailand, I was told that he has many jobs. You know, he was a coolie, he was a chef, he was everything, right? He's tried different things, and somehow he managed to find himself doing some sort of, I think he was doing some cashier work. So maybe one thing lead to another. He started a bank now, but of course, back then, I'm pretty sure it wasn't a bank. It's more like a money lender to start with. So so those stories, I mean, make a huge dent in me growing up. I mean, obviously, as I said, it's not just on him. Many Chinese at the time. I mean, these are stories that I think today we somehow took for granted. I mean, and now we're talking about a lot. Of course, under today's Chinese, the latest China policy. We're going, Belt and Road Initiative, going to these countries. But honestly, it's not new. Our forefathers,
Right, yeah.
our forefathers, all these Chinese have ventured themselves out to all over the world. You find them everywhere in the world, right? So that's how I grew up with that sort of background. My father being the eldest, he was the only one born in the mainland. Thereafter, all his siblings were born in Thailand. He spent majority of his time in Hong Kong, while all his siblings, are based in Bangkok. So for me, my immediate family is here, but all my cousins, my uncles, and everybody are Thai-based.
So it's from Thailand. Then you went to study in the US, right? You went to the Hill School in Pennsylvania, and then Pomona in California. So what was that like, spending your formative years in the US? And what were some of the key insights or lessons that you took away from your time in the United States?
Well, I had 3 years of boarding school, East Coast, and then I spent 5 years in West Coast in college. Now, we're not going to spend too much time on the detail, but there is a very important event that took place while I was in college that completely changed my life upside down. Was my health.
Yes.
I was basically diagnosed with a very rare disease shortly after my first semester in college. So I underwent, give you a short version of the story. I underwent 3 bypass surgery, not heart surgery, not heart bypass, but a bypass to my brain, carotid bypass, and 2 renal bypasses to my kidney and so on. So basically, I spent every other semester outside of campus in hospital or in recuperation. So that completely had changed my complete perspective of life, because apart from just being being hospitalized, the disease is an ongoing thing. Although now, so many years later, is pretty much in remission. But for the good 10 years plus, 10, 15 years, I was basically in our hospital for all kinds of tests and so on. So it was tough. It was tough on me, and it took me a good 10 years to finally overcome this mindset of mine. I think, you know, I spent a good few years in denial, not wanting to accept the fact that I'm going to be a sick person for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
So finally, I think, I don't know what happened. I couldn't remember now, but it was something like 10 plus years later. I finally come to accept that I just have to, this is it. This is my life. I might as well just deal with it. But the amazing thing is, once you accept that, things open up for you. By the way, so in case you're not aware, because of me spending so much time off campuses, I decided to switch my major to something that I thought would be easier, and also I can do remotely. Now, obviously back then there's no Zoom and anything, right?
Right.
So the one subject I found that allowed me to do so is studio art, so painting. So I paint, you know. But guess what? Thank goodness I went ahead and studied studio art. I think that's what actually makes me different from everyone else, because the whole studio art, well, of course, I'm not a professional artist, but what the teaching allows me is to think out the box, to allow me to be creative, to things. And so I accredit a lot of who I am today is because of that training of mine, to allow me to think, you know, beyond what I've been told all the time.
Yeah, and I want to cover that. In fact, but Bernard, you know, the kind of the health issue that you went in through as a young man, I'm wondering, did that give you this extra drive? Because I've got an abbreviated list of some of your public service activities, right? The full list, I can't even read, it's just too long, right? You're the chairperson of the Hong Kong Council of Social Service, right? The vice chair of Oxfam Hong Kong, the chairman of the Council for Sustainable Development, the chairman of the Antiquities Advisory Board, board member of the West Kowloon Cultural District Authority, and chairman of the Hong Kong Palace Museum. So first of all, I'm completely in awe, and I'm also very grateful for all that you've done. Because, you know, as a public servant, when things go right, others take the credit, and when things go wrong, you end up taking the blame. So I kind of understand now, just based on the story you told me. My question was, you know, where did this dedication to serving others come from?
Well, I can't say that it was to do with my upbringing, but my medical saga really has changed my perspective towards life. Basically, at the end, as I said, after that whole 10 plus year, I finally realized that, hey, listen, if I'm going to live short life, then I might as well make the full use of it.
And but how did your connection to Thailand, how did that kind of shape your views, right? Coming from this multicultural background, you know, Hong Kong, China, Thailand. Maybe explain that to us.
Right. Well, it's actually beyond Thailand. If you look at even just my operations, and it's actually a lot to do with Bangkok Bank. You know, when Bangkok Bank was first started, it was not just a bank for the Thai people. In fact, I was pretty sure told that this is not for Thai people, and mostly for the Chinese people. You know, a lot of the overseas Chinese people couldn't get financing. So Bangkok Bank came in as an alternative to provide funding to Chinese people, overseas Chinese people. And it's not just overseas Chinese people in Thailand, it's throughout the entire ASEAN, right? And one reason to that is they share common languages. So when Bangkok Bank opened in multiple locations in Southeast Asia, they can communicate. I was told that when Bangkok Bank, you know, in the 70s, 80s, it was like the bank for all overseas Chinese in the region, right? So that gave us a very good footing into all these countries. Back then, you know, there's much less of a governance issue. So I suppose if you trust these people enough to lend them money, then you might as well also invest in them, right? So me growing up, I mean, I know ASEAN very well. I mean, I have friends in ASEAN because of the family and the relationship, customers, and so on. So you're absolutely right. My perspective is not just Hong Kong, but it's actually very ASEAN. For the longest time, until the last few years, I was the only one pushing the ASEAN agenda in Hong Kong.
Wow.
Now, nobody was really paying attention to me for a good reason, because for the last 20 years, I mean, you have one single market that is so big, which is China. So the all focus is looked in China, which I don't disagree. But I truly believe Hong Kong's role should not just be like just one directional. We should be the bridge to the whole region. And ASEAN should be a one because it's the proximity and also the relationship, right? But again, I can't blame government or the business or anybody, because you put the whole ASEAN together, it's no match to even just one China, right? So why you bother spend the time, right? So I know even all this year, I'm like a lone voice. I knew that it's not going to go very far, but that changed, Tom.
Yeah.
You know, in the last couple of years, changed. And you know why it changed? It wasn't changed because Hong Kong people decided ASEAN is so important. It wasn't because of Hong Kong. You know what it is? It's because China.
Right.
China. What? Because of the Belt and Road and other things, right? And ASEAN is a very logical, place for them to invest. So it is because of China is interested in ASEAN, and Hong Kong being always a conduit, right? Hong Kong has always been a logical conduit for Chinese company to venture to the world. So because of that reason, many of the professional people, services, and so on in Hong Kong realize, oh my goodness, we should really go to ASEAN. And by the way, it's not difficult because, as I said again, there are already many relationships with ASEAN from years ago. And again, many countries in ASEAN are very receptive to Chinese culture. Some country more than the other, but in general, I think we're not talking about a complete cultural shock. And somewhat, but then the latest drive is not from Hong Kong; it's because of China. It's China's interest in ASEAN is driving that relationship so much so today. The latest number now, ASEAN is the second biggest market for Hong Kong after China. I was so indebted to Mr. Kwok, Mr. Robert Kwok of Shangri-La Group or Kerry Group for his generosity given to our family and so on. So much that in his memoir, he actually has a few pages dedicated to talk about this relationship he has with my grandfather, because I guess during his time, again, as I said again, it was not easy to get financing, and so my grandfather, was his first banker. Now, mind you, today when you talk about getting a facility, you probably have to have collateral, you probably have to have certain things, right? But back then, hey, nobody has anything. So it's more about trust.
What it sounds like to me is, your grandfather and Robert Kwok, your grandfather was almost like an original, he would be a venture capitalist today.
Well, I suppose most people back then, it must be, because they all take a lot of risk. They all took a lot of risk. I'm pretty sure, all those who became successful now, I'm sure when they first start off, it's nothing like that, right?
In 2017, you were invited by Joe Tsai and Cindy Tsao to join the board of the Alibaba Entrepreneurs Fund. And it was through that relationship that I've had the pleasure of working with you and serving as a fellow judge for the Jumpstarter, global pitch competition. And I remember that when we first started, Bernard, there were a lot of skeptics, right? Very few people believed that Hong Kong could produce homegrown tech entrepreneurs or create a thriving tech ecosystem. Today, through that fund, we've now invested into 3 Hong Kong-based unicorns, Airwallex, GoGoX, and WeLab. And there are more in the pipeline, such as AutoX and DataCook. A lot of people in the audience today are entrepreneurs, and they may be thinking, should I set up my startup in Hong Kong? Should I relocate there? What's the tech ecosystem like? Are there support systems and favorable government policies in place? So as an entrepreneur yourself, Bernard, what would you say to them?
Tom, I have to say, I was probably among one of those skeptics early on. Partly because we have always been so focused on financial services, right? We are one of the three biggest IFC in the world, right? So even I have a certain doubt. It's like, wow, do we actually have that ecosystem, right? And so I am, by the way, so grateful for Joe, and Alibaba to launch this entrepreneur fund. I think that really changed that whole perception.
Yeah.
Of course, we still have works to do, and I also think that also changed Hong Kong government as well. So kind of like my story earlier when I told you that the government didn't really do much with ASEAN. Well, they didn't do much with ASEAN because there was really not much of demand on ASEAN at the time. So government obviously don't care. Now that is completely changed today. We didn't put much huge focus on the IoT then, but today's a different story.
Yes.
Today's a whole different story.
Yes.
Now we are doing catch up. We definitely do catch up because again, like my ASEAN story, yes, we kind of like didn't put that much focus on it, but today we do, right? So I think I think my only concern early on is also always about scale. Is Hong Kong scalable for these things, right? But now, see, the amazing story is it's not just Hong Kong we're talking about; it's the entire GBA. Now, yes. So if we're looking just Hong Kong as an ecosystem just for Hong Kong, then I must say, it can be a tough sale, right? But if you are now talking about using Hong Kong and then the entire GBA, that's a whole different story. But for sure, the outlook is fantastic, given that we also have the blessing from central government. The whole GBA, I can talk more about the GBA later on. Why is it so important that we already get the blessing from central government to promote innovation technology? Is part of the mandate given to us.
Let's continue on GBA. In fact, maybe just for the benefit of our audience, GBA stands for the Greater Bay Area, right? And it's a term that we keep hearing about. It's an initiative to integrate 9 cities in the Pearl River Delta in Guangdong, cities such as Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and Zhuhai, with international powerhouses, Hong Kong and Macau. They call this the 9+2. The GBA serves a market with 70 million people and a combined GDP of 1.6 trillion. And just to put that into perspective, I know Bernard knows this, but for our audience, the GBA serves a market with a population the size of the United Kingdom and an economy that's the same size as South Korea. This is real exciting stuff, right? Or is the GBA just a bunch of hype? Bernard, you have an insider's perspective. Can you help our viewers understand why the GBA is so exciting, right? You've already mentioned it a couple of times in our discussion. Are there real concrete policies and government investment schemes that are being implemented to make GBA a reality?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Now, the concept of this collaboration is not new. I still remember my involvement with this whole concept way back in 2008. So it may have been even before 2008 when this all started. But back then, it wasn't called GBA. It's called Pearl River Delta.
That's right. Yeah. PRD.
Pearl River Delta, yeah. PRD. So it wasn't new. Now, I guess the main difference between Pearl River Delta and now GBA was that, from my understanding, is back then with PRD was really much of a regional collaboration. So you have Guangdong, Shenzhen, Hong Kong. We'll try to figure out a way how do we collaborate together. Now, mind you, these places, of course we are partners, but we're also competitors. We are competitors. So somehow, I guess we could have done much better, but it is what it is. But now with Greater Bay Area, this is no longer just simply a regional collaboration. This is actually a national agenda. It is in the annual speech by the Prime Minister. So it is a complete top-down approach, right? So you mentioned that the nine cities and the 2 special administrative regions. We don't just talk among ourselves. Actually, there's a working committee. The working committee is actually chaired by the Vice Premier, Han Zheng.
Wow.
So the difference is there's coordination at the top level, such that there's no duplication of resources. Now, if you don't have that kind of coordination, I bet you're going to have like 20 airports in the region, this area.
Yes.
So the story I'm saying is this whole GBA concept allows this whole effort being done, but not just simply between between you and I, but it's at the top, at the national agenda. How do we maximize that collaboration without overlapping and duplication?
Hey, Bernard, in January 2008, you were elected to the National People's Congress, the highest organ of state power in China, as one of 36 Hong Kong deputies. So I know you're very modest, but you've got access, right to the top leadership in China. And so you've got kind of a pulse as to what the leadership is thinking. And one of the key initiatives, in addition to GBA, is also the Belt and Road Initiative, right? BRI. And that's a very ambitious project by the Chinese government, again, to create better interconnectivity, but this time across the entire Asia Pacific region, Africa, and Europe. I mean, this is a massive effort covering 70 countries, and it's going to require trillions of dollars of investments into infrastructure, right? Ports, highways, railroads. Some liken this to kind of China's Marshall Plan, right? You've got real insight into Beijing and what the leadership is thinking. As BRI gains more traction, what's Hong Kong's role for BRI? Well, maybe an even more fundamental question: does Hong Kong have a role to play in BRI?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Tom, I hope you don't overplay my my role in the People Congress. Yeah, I don't have complete access to the top leaders, but I have to say by actually having SOE, state-owned enterprise, as my joint venture partners, I have I have a very one of my core business as a joint venture with one of the largest SOE in China, and I also sit on other SOE as the independent non-executive directors. I actually learn and appreciate what they are thinking. The SOE are also just a extension of the government, so exactly what they have in mind, and it makes sense. China needs connectivity, to the world. The only thing I would say that maybe they don't want to play up so much about this whole BRI thing, to the extent that it actually raised a lot of excitement from other countries, because like I said about this whole thing about threat, right? Now everyone sees that, China is extending the threat to outside China, right? So I'm not sure whether it was the right thing to do, but then no, it's the right thing to do, but whether it was right to try to make too much noises about it,
Right.
Yeah. Because but it makes a lot of sense. Every country wants to trade with China, right? You look at ASEAN, you look at Australia and Europe. Which country do not want to trade with China, or even the US for that matter, right? It's in everyone's interest to do that. It makes a lot of sense for China, but of course, it also raised that whole all these skeptics around, is China trying to impose their value to us, impose their standards, so on and so on. Well, I don't think that is their intention. I think their intention is always about about trade and bilateral of mutual interest. So now Hong Kong role, well, again, from my understanding, many of those companies, Chinese companies, when they expand to a lot of these regions, they like to use the Hong Kong subsidiary, right? Mm-hmm. Because the Hong Kong subsidiary are already based out in Hong Kong. So they have the flexibility. So many, the SOE, the state-owned enterprises, they all have subsidiaries in Hong Kong. And those subsidiaries allow them the flexibility to go out to do business in different places. Right. So one is the flexibility. Second, of course, is the legal system. Many of the counterparts in these countries will much prefer to do deal with company in Hong Kong using Hong Kong law. You have the currency mobility, so that's easier too. How is it like in China? Every time when you need to take money out of China, it takes time.
Yes.
Right. So if the money already in Hong Kong, it gives them that mobility, to go in and out much quicker. So I think Hong Kong served that a very good purpose for Chinese company going abroad.
Now I want to just take the discussion in a slightly different direction. You had an on-the-ground view of the Hong Kong protests in 2019. And some in the Western media and some politicians, they like to demonize China. I think you were saying China's getting big, they're viewed as a threat. And they try to portray the protesters in Hong Kong as freedom fighters, essentially. And over the months, there was destruction of property. Unfortunately, there was the deliberate injuring of police officers. But that was viewed as almost acceptable collateral damage, right? And I remember you had an interview with BBC, and you kind of pushed back on that narrative. And almost 2 years later, on January 6th, 2021, there was a protest in Washington, D.C. This time, the destruction of property and deliberately injuring police officers was not acceptable. So what changed? And do politicians and reporters have a double standard? And can you maybe contrast kind of the Western media coverage and official political statements regarding these two separate incidents? What's your view on that?
Tom, I tell you, you're absolutely correct. This last 2 years has been so amazing. I mean, in a negative way. I mean, you could not imagine the things what happened to Hong Kong in 2019 is unthinkable, right? It's unprecedented, it's unthinkable. Equally, the event happened on January 6th in the capital in the US is also unthinkable too, right? Now, and it's pretty scary. How scary the world has been so polarized.
Yes.
Right? It really comes down to that, right? Now, the story behind each are different. Now, Hong Kong has its own problem. The US has their own problem. Now, but it's also being played up by social media, and it definitely have driven the so-called, I suppose this is the echo chamber, right? So, and it's sad because people won't even bother to listen. People don't even want to make an attempt to try to figure out where the problems are and how we can resolve the differences. Now, Hong Kong issues are very different from the US, right? Hong Kong issues are, now, of course, it all started with this so-called the extradition bill. But the extradition bill is not, in fact, it's not the only problem. Again, it's back to what I said earlier, the fear, right? And what is the fear? Now, when I grew up in Hong Kong, even at the time of 97, when changeover, right? We were told 50 years and change, right? The system, Hong Kong 50 years and change, and we all very happy. At the time, I was 32. 50 years, wow, it's like, 82, if I'm still around. So it's almost like, it's not my problem. You know what everyone have failed to do? Hong Kong people, politicians, or even China. We all have failed to do? We all have failed to prepare for this so-called integration to happen. Because we never thought the integration would happen, at least not now, at least not for until 30 years, 40 years. But guess what? In the last 20 years, China just kept moving like this, right? To the point that it has become a threat, right? People are worried about being marginalized. Our Hong Kong youth are worried. I don't blame them, right? Because if you look at all the numbers, our stock market today is 70% traded on Chinese stocks, not on Hong Kong stocks, right? You look at of the 60 million tourists that comes to Hong Kong, 47 million are from China.
Wow.
So if you're the merchandiser, who are you sourcing for? you sourcing for them,
Right.
right? Our education, on average, 10% of our students at each university are from mainland China, and they're the best from China. So I can understand the fear and the worry that, wow, you know, would, would Hong Kong still be Hong Kong given another 10, 15 years? So they're already a build up of, you can call it resentment, you can call it it's fear, you can call it, the fact that they feel like, would we still be who we are? Will we be all marginalized? So it's been, and then of course, politicians play up that fear, the opposition play up that fear. But honestly, did China do this on purpose? Because I got asked all the time, oh, this is Communist Party, CCP, try to take over Hong Kong, try to suppress Hong Kong people. Honestly, it's not. Chinese government have no interest in meddling Hong Kong matter until now, because they saw what happened. They said, well, I have to step in. But before, they have bigger problem. Why would they care about Hong Kong? But you know what is actually happening? Market, supply and demand. It is changing. We have a rising 300 million middle class in China, right? So what do that 300 million middle class Chinese consumer want? They want better access to education. They want better access to wealth management product, better access to healthcare.
Yes.
And guess what? Some are buying onshore, some buying offshore. They go to the world to buy it, and Hong Kong is obvious choice. So they're competing with us on these resources. It's the same happening everywhere in the world, except that it doesn't make that impact in the rest of the world. But to us, as a place of only 7 million people, you can feel the impact.
Immediately, yes.
Right. So people are scared, understandably. So we have to address the problem. By the way, they're also coming to buy our housing too.
Right. Yeah.
And they drive up our price, right? So as a very open, market-driven model here, we got a problem, right? So that's why, and again, it's not Hong Kong issue. You see, in Sydney, in San Francisco, that whole polarization is increasing, especially after 10 years of QE. So the have and the have not gap continue. The frustration is there. Every city, major city, you see that, except that in Hong Kong, we point the fingers in China. We think China is the culprit. We think China is the problem, right? So honestly, we have a problem. Don't pretend that we don't have a problem. We have a problem. But can we just blame China on that? Is China the culprit all behind it? By the way, I tell you, Tom, you may not know, until 2003, Chinese tourists are not allowed freely to come to Hong Kong. 2003.
Yeah.
They were only allowed to come by group tour, and there's a quota. They're not allowed to come. But you know what happened in 2000? Why that changed? You know what happened in 2003?
Did they open up the group tours, or?
That was the last pandemic, SARS.
Oh, that's right.
So when SARS came, by May of 2003, our economy tanked. We went way down. People freak out. No one's coming. Where's that now? And that's what we did. Hong Kong government went to Beijing and asked them for help, asked them to save our economy. And that's when the Chinese government decided to send us tourists.
Right.
To allow Chinese citizens to freely come to Hong Kong. Well, not all Chinese citizens, but they opened that gate. It's also around the same time that Chinese SOE come to Hong Kong IPO. So that's when all the major bank, all the insurance are coming.
That's right.
Now, all those things are not just good for Hong Kong, it's also good for China, right? Win-win. But the point is that was a turning point because we asked them to help. But it was the right thing to do at the time to save our economy. So
too much of a good thing is what you're saying.
It was a V-shaped rebound.
Yeah.
It was a V-shaped rebound at the time. But now looking back, well, it is, some of the problem that we are facing today are of that result, right? Because but anyway, my point is we didn't manage that so-called integration well. So we are now, Hong Kong is massively integrating with China economically and socially, but not politically. Because politically, we're still under two systems. But can you imagine when you have massive economic and social integration, and yet there's no political integration? So these issues keep popping up. Extradition is the same. We have people now travel so heavily coming to Hong Kong, including criminals. Then what do you do with them? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So all the issue came around because of this massive integration that we didn't really prepare for. But was it a bad thing? No, I think we need it now. I'm talking about GBA now. That's the other. That's why that's the challenge. While economically, socially, we are increasingly like one, but then politically, it's still a different system. So how do you address those issues?
Great points, Bernard. And now I'm just going to kind of bring this to a close with probably one of with the elephant in the room, which is let's talk about U.S.-China relationships, especially over the last 4 years. From your standpoint, what happened? And what's the outlook under President Biden? Can the U.S. and China kind of coexist, cooperate, or are we doomed to enter into a new Cold War?
Well, I think I alluded to this earlier, that I see China and U.S., and other countries as well, they need each other, or they all need each other. So I just cannot imagine why would they want one to succeed and not the other. So I think that also I'm still quite hopeful. I still think that the intention is still reasonably good. Now, doesn't mean that there are no differences. There are tons of differences, and don't mind you though, they each have their own constituents to be accountable to.
Yes.
So it's not so much as just Biden himself or Xi Jinping himself. Each of them have their own constituency. So, and that's a complicated thing. So I think perhaps that differences and the tension will remain. Now, hopefully, the hostility may dial down a little bit. But as I said again repeatedly earlier, China continues to be a threat to the U.S. So it can easily be played by politicians, both sides of the aisle, right? It's a common target. It's a common target now. So I think this will remain. This will remain. But I still hope that there's still enough ground for dialogue in trade, because they both need each other, and perhaps also on some common topics where there is a common interest to resolve together, like climate change, for that matter.
Well, yeah, it's the obvious.
Right. So there are still areas where they cooperate, but of course there are certain things that they will never agree with each other. Such as the whole human rights issue, to the whole governance issue, because it's really a whole different set of culture. So those differences I don't expect to narrow at all, and will continue. It will continue. So I just hope that with the Biden administration, things are perhaps back to more of the norm,
yes,
where you don't have surprises. Because with the Trump administration, you really don't know. I mean, you just don't know what will be next, right? So it's pretty scary. So I think with Biden, hopefully, they should go back to a certain form of normality where you can figure out how each country will respond to certain things. At least both sides knows what the protocols are to work out our difference. Oh, by the way, there is another common topic as well, and this is a tricky one, is public health.
Yeah.
We have, so with COVID and so on, and how did the world reconnect back to each other? It's a big topic. Will US trust China, the vaccine? How do each country respond to the vaccination? Because right now every country is really just working on their own solution. But eventually, everybody has to come to a common protocol that they can all agree and accept. Because you can't just have your vaccination, and if your vaccination is not being accepted to someone else, then there's no use, right? So all these are still, I'm sure WHO is working on it, but everyone has to agree to that.
Bernard, thank you so much. On that note, we've covered so much ground today, and we've taken so much of your valuable time. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's been enlightening and informative, and I'm sure our audience is going to enjoy this. So once again, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.